Good evening, everyone. So in our burst of inspiration this evening, we are going to be briefly having a look at one of the most enigmatic, fascinating episodes in the whole of Sefer Bereshit. I'm referring no less to the incident involving Jacob, our patriarch, who found himself in the middle of the night, completely alone, and found himself confronted with an enemy, a mysterious individual who turned out to be the Malach, the celestial being, the angel of Esav, who he struggled with throughout the night. Vayishlach Yaakov levado, Yaakov found himself alone, and he struggled there with this mysterious figure until the morning, until it was light and day. So let's try and understand this on a much deeper level. What was going on? We know that this was the moment in Jewish history when we became known as Yisrael. So just to clarify, we are, as far as I can see, on YouTube and on Facebook, on the usual places. So we should be able to all find each other. But either way, Rebecca, Richard, Estelle, and everyone else, it's lovely to see you. So let's take a deeper look at this. And I want to share with you, there are so many lessons. One of them we sent out earlier, but there are so many deep and profound ideas that really will transform your mindset in terms of how we are meant to deal with adversity, how we are meant to deal with challenges in our everyday lives. So the Leshem, who was Rav Shalom Eliashiv, the grandfather of the great Rav Yosef Shalom Eliashiv, said that when the Satan was struggling with Jacob, with Yaakov, it was a struggle between good and evil, as we're all familiar. But it was not just a physical struggle, although it was, but it was also a spiritual struggle in terms of ideologies, philosophies. And we know that Jacob was the patriarchs, and matriarchs are very much like a seed from a tree, that they are able to embody and to embrace and encompass everything that is going to follow on from them. So all the future trees that will come from this seed are in that one little seed that you're holding in your hand. Okay? So in everything that would happen to the Jewish people are contained in the lives of our patriarchs, like the seed of a tree. So let us have a look and understand what happened to Jacob. And once we've understood what happened to Jacob, then we will be able to understand perhaps a bit about ourselves and why it is that on occasions we all feel like we are rather down, we feel maybe dejected, we feel low about ourselves, and we don't feel particularly confident and have a lot of self-belief. And this all comes from this episode relating to Jacob's angel, and Yaakov. Sorry, Jacob and Esav's angel. So it goes like this. So in this struggle, we know that what happened to Jacob, what happened to Yaakov. We know that they were wrestling backwards and forwards, and all of a sudden, the Malach, the celestial being, who took on a physical appearance, managed to dislocate when he was desperate, managed to take a low shot at Jacob in dislocating the thigh, the sinew of the thigh, and for that reason, that's why we don't eat the sinew of the thigh to this very day. Okay, so what exactly is represented by the sinew of the thigh? That was the place of weakness. That was the place where Jacob was damaged. And as we said, and I'll say it again, if it happened to our patriarchs before us, then it must be that it's a forewarning of what is going to happen and unfold in Jewish history and to each and every one of us as his descendants. So it goes like this. When they struggled, Jacob recognized this was an epic encounter and struggle, not just between him and another person, but the whole embodiment of Israel. And therefore, it wasn't just a physical encounter, but it was a spiritual, psychological, emotional encounter. So what's the battle? How does Yaakov encounter the enemy? What is it that's being thrown in the way of a spiritual adversary to Jacob? And the answer is that it would be the very worst thoughts, the very worst emotions and feelings were thrown towards Jacob, right? In other words, what we are describing is that Jacob, fought this adversary, this battle between himself and Esau, the embodiment of evil. And it was a battle that was being fought on multiple dimensions and levels. And therefore, when they were on the spiritual, psychological dimension, what was being thrown against Jacob was the psychological, the emotional, the bad thoughts that we all have, the bad feelings that we sometimes have. All of that was heading Jacob's way. And remember, it's not just Yaakov fighting, but it's in the Yaakov's fight is a battle that we all have. So there was one area. So Jacob was able to fend off everything that was being thrown his way. But as we mentioned, there was one area of weakness that the angel that was fighting him managed to grab hold of and to dislocate, to weaken Jacob. What was that? That was the Gid Hanoshem. And what we will see, and I'm not expecting us to understand it, but sometimes we just have to throw, Rabbi Tatz always says, sometimes we have lofty concepts that we throw them out, mystical concepts, and we work around them so that we have some understanding. So don't worry about the concept I'm going to say now, but we'll build off it so that eventually we'll understand, looking back at some of what we are talking about now. There are in the world various what's called sfirot, okay? So there are, for example, some of them that we'll be familiar with is the idea of chesed, kindness, gevura, strength. So two of them that are a mark of weakness on the Jewish people as a result of this battle are the sfirot, the spheres of Netzach and Hod, okay? Beauty and Netzach, I guess, is triumph or salvation, something like that. I can't even pronounce it in English correctly. So the Samuel the prophet he said he was able to repair one of those two areas that Jacob had suffered damage, weakness, and injury as a result of that epic encounter. But there was nonetheless a weakness. Fast forward to the story of Hanukkah, and of course we have to get in a bit about the Hanukkah, and we find that Matisyahu was the high priest at the time. It was the time of the Hanukkah story, and he was able to also repair the other dimension of Hod, of beauty, the outer beauty, right? We know that Hod, beauty, was damaged by the Greeks in that they saw it as something very superficial, very, very much looking at things in a outer dimensional way. That's the way they viewed the world. And ultimately, although they had patched things up or they had repaired it to some degree, the next stage for these repairing these two virtues and sfirot would be at the time of the Messiah. So the Leshem says as follows: everything in this world comes from the higher world. So there is a concept in this world that we are all familiar with, and that is the concept of opposites. Think about opposites. The opposite of white is black, right? We have many different opposites, your left, your right, and there are many, there's sweet and bitter, there's many different opposites. There's opposites in virtues, opposites in characteristics, there's opposites in this world. But usually when you have opposites, how does it operate? You know how it operates, Estelle? It operates that the opposites are different things. Bitterness and sweet are two opposites, but they don't coincide in the same place. But it is possible. There is, as always, an exception, and there is one area in this world where it's possible for there to be opposites that are in exact same area. They operate over the exact same thing. And that's what we want to explore today. And through exploring the opposites which operate in the same area, we will understand more about ourselves And once we understand more about ourselves, we will then be in a position to rectify or to revitalize, to strengthen, to fortify the areas of weakness, so that when we are feeling rather weak, rather down, rather depressed, rather dejected, rather low in self-esteem, we will be able to identify in ourselves where that is coming from and how to deal with it. Okay, so we are taking lofty ideas and hopefully we're going to apply it to our everyday lives. So he says that if we think about in terms of concepts, the concept of chesed, kindness, is the idea of overflowing goodness. There is no measure when it comes to kindness. You just give, you just do. There is no measurement when it comes to kindness. Whereas gvura, which is its opposite, which stands directly opposite it, is something that is strict justice, which is measured, which is contained. Okay, so those are opposites, but they're not operating in the same area. But there is the idea that you can have two things that are operating, two ideas, two opposites that operate in the same thing, in the same area. So we'll come back to that, but let me first share with you where there was opposites. Rav Nachman of Breslov, he tells a very famous story. The story, if you Google it, you'll see the full story. I'm just going to tell you one or two liners, which are teasers, and that is as follows. He tells a story about the Great Switch. It was I think it was a true story. There was a prince that was born to royalty, and there was a servant that had a child. So you had a child that was a prince, a baby that was a prince, and a baby that was born from a servant. Okay. In the hospital, the midwife intentionally swapped the babies. So you had a baby that was from royalty, blue-blooded, that was now growing up in the house of a servant. And you had the baby that had grown up or had been born from a house of servitude and was now growing up in the house of royalty. And in the story, he describes fascinatingly the fact that this child, this baby, let's focus, perhaps it's easier to focus on the prince, as he grew up and as he matured, he knew who he was inside. And although he was brought up as a servant, conditioned to be a servant, there was something inside himself that on occasion made him think and believe that he was something more than the way he was conducting himself, the way he was acting. And on occasion he paused and he said, I know who I am. It can't be that I should behave this way. But then he did, because he said to himself, but this is a situation that I find myself in. And therefore, if I'm in a condition, in a situation of servitude, it must be that I have to continue acting as a servant. And we could have a whole discussion about this. It is absolutely a fascinating story, and you could look at it from the servant's perspective and from the prince's perspective. Both of them, of course, had moments where they were able to hone back to their origins and to feel the way they originally came from, their biological DNA, which was one was servitude and the other one was royalty. So there is an idea, and that is in Jewish thought, the idea of Heichal Hatzmurot, and that is the idea that there is a possibility that, well, not a possibility, a reality that we switch between different emotions and feelings. We switch between different experiences, and it can happen simultaneously to the same person. So 1 minute, it can happen days apart, or it could happen the very next moment. So imagine a person can turn around and can say to themselves, I'm feeling, I've just done an act of kindness. I just sent a card, I made a phone call, I've helped somebody, and you feel good about yourself. You feel proud, you feel a sense of accomplishment, you find a sense of fulfillment, you feel good. The very same person, it could be a day later, it could be a week later, or it could even be a few minutes later. And all of a sudden, something, the Satan gets in one's head, you hear this voice, and you trip up. And as you trip up, you start to feel lousy about yourself. You start to feel, and you hear a voice in your head saying, actually, this is who you really are. You're rubbish. You're inconsistent. You're not going to be anything. You're not going to accomplish anything. Give up. That was just a dream. That was a facade. That's not who you really are. Really, who you are is where you are right now. When you are going through this lousy experience, you're having a stumble, you're having a fall, you lowered your standards, whatever it is. And the question really for us is, how and when do we decide to define ourselves? You see, in the story that I told you by Rav Nachman of Breslov, those two characters in the story, the prince and the servant, had moments of visions of visions of as to who they truly were. And then they pushed it to the back of their mind. So they fluctuated between different personas. We all have that experience. We vacillate between different emotions and different experiences. And the question is, at which moment are we going to choose to define ourselves? Let me tell you about a story. Sadly, a very, very true story, one that you may have heard. Very briefly, you may have heard of Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was a great high priest, a great man, who in fact was the high priest at the time of the Second Temple for 80 years. In fact, they tell the story that when Alexander the Great came to destroy Israel and was going to destroy the temple, he saw Alexander the Great met Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the righteous, this high priest, and he was so taken with his aura that he automatically bowed down in front of him. He asked for a blessing. That's why so many Jewish children, as a result, are called Alexander. It's seen as a Jewish name. We took it on ourselves that year to name our kids Alexander in appreciation to Alexander the Great, who decided not to destroy the temple. But it was in the merit of Shimon HaTzadik. Now listen to this, friends. This great, great high priest, one of the greatest ever, and yet he became a heretic. Something was triggered. Something happened to him one day. And like we've already spoken, he fluctuated and he went the other way. But instead of flicking back, he's defined himself by that moment of lowness, that moment of stumbling, that moment where he had a fall. And he decided, if this is where I have reached, this is who I truly am. And he completely wrote off 80 years as a high priest and became a heretic, and he was no more considered Shimon HaTzadik. I'll give you another example. I can give you several, which are, the Talmud makes no excuses. It says it in black and white. Some of the greatest rabbis, and we can discuss another time why it is that this happened. Elisha ben Avuya, one of the greatest sages ever, who's now referred to in the Talmud. We've discussed it before as Acher, the other. We don't even mention his name. There is such an embarrassment about him. And he was somebody who, because he had heretical thoughts, because he questioned he had questions of faith over something that he saw in his life that made him question his faith. He lost his faith. He started to do the wrong thing, and things just snowballed. And eventually, despite his great wisdom and piety, he left the fold. He carried on learning, but it was just an intellectual exercise. And he didn't believe, despite his student, who became one of the greatest sages, Rameir, saying to him, "Come back, my teacher, come back, Elisha, Elisha ben Avuya, you're one of the greatest sages." He says, "No, I believe that I can't come back. and he defined himself by that moment where he fell. And it's such a common phenomenon. There are so many opportunities, so many stories of people that were great, that were going to accomplish great things as individuals, and yet they stumbled, and their blinkered vision stopped them from being able to see the whole of their lives, the entirety, and they just because they fluctuated and ended up falling, they focused on that moment, and that's defined the rest of their lives. So the point being, if we think about where we came from, where we originated from, we in reality were and are the greatest of nations. We were redeemed from Exodus, from slavery. The greatest empire at its time, Egypt, was brought to its knees. It was literally crumbling. It was no longer a great empire. We went on to receive the Torah, the greatest moment, divine revelation, marching into the land of Israel. All the other nations were on their knees. They were like servants. We were princes. And yet, time and again in history, because we have stumbled and fallen, therefore we have chosen as a matter of choice to define ourselves by moments when we were the slaves rather than we were princes. And it's a terrible, terrible indictment on us. And this, friends, is the Gid Hanasha, the sinew of the thigh. This is the only place, this is how the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, the Satan, gets into our heads, our psyche, and is able to poison us, to put a cancerous growth inside our minds, our hearts, and stop and hinder us from true growth. And therefore, instead of us believing in ourselves, we define ourselves by moments of weakness. And in truth, we fluctuate. We vacillate between all different moments. Imagine the following. I don't know if you can remember back to going on roller coasters. I have to say, there are many things. I love all aspects of life and thrill. I hate roller coasters. But if we use roller coasters as an analogy, my kids love roller coasters. So you go up, and then all of a sudden you go flying down. Then what happens? You go steadily up, then you come flying down. How do you define yourself? How do people see themselves on roller coasters? Is this do you see it that you're going up, or do you see it that basically you're only going up in order to come down? How do we define ourselves? So when we find ourselves in our lives, and this is the critical point I want you to remember, and this is what we have to get into our heads. When we find ourselves in our lives as being inconsistent, at best, very often, the Satan makes us see ourselves as inconsistent. And at worst, it says that when we had that slippage, we allow that slippage not to be seen as inconsistent, but to be seen as who we are. As in other words, we have fallen. That is who we are. So not just are we inconsistent, sometimes we go even further and say that we're fallen, we're sinners, we're rubbish, we're tarnished, we're write-offs, it's too late, we can't accomplish or achieve. What is the antidote to this way of thinking? And I hear it time and again. Rabbi, I'm a sinner. I'm not religious. I'm not spiritual. I don't live a committed life. And it is exactly the Esav Satan thinking which has got into our psyche, not just as a nationhood, but as individuals. And it hinders and prevents us in our professional lives, in our emotional, psychological, and our spiritual lives. How do we overcome this? What's the antidote? So one of the dangers is that I don't know if you ever read the books about great people, but in many from homes, there are these books which they're called the books of Gedolim. They're books about great people. In other words, great sages. There'll probably be one in a few years about Rabbi Sachs, but in the meantime, there's books about Moshe Feinstein, the Chofetz Chaim, who I'm sure you've heard of. the Vilna Gaon. And one of the things that you do is that in these books, it's not so much a history book, although it does tell their life story, but it brings many, many anecdotes of their greatness. So it will show about the great consideration and sensitivity that they had for widows and for paupers, and the kindness that they showed and the lengths they went to help the Jewish people. But one of the dangers of that book is that people afterwards, when they've read a story of inspiration, it could be any story that you've ever heard or watched a video, Stan, Estelle, Carol, anyone who's heard a story that's really inspired them and lifted their spirits, is that afterwards you say to yourself, you start to compare yourself with that person. You say, I'm not that person. They're up there in the clouds. I can't possibly bring about change. Therefore, instead of being inspired by that story, by that individual's act of greatness, it actually can push us further down. So what we need to do, and this is the antidote, is to actually really study people and to recognize that every person has the same struggles on their own level as ourselves. The greatness is the fact that they were prepared and they had the courage and tenacity and temerity to pick themselves up time and again when they faltered and fell, and to keep going, to keep growing. That is what we have to bear in mind. So when I remember Rabbi Sachs, it was his farewell a few years ago. He was saying goodbye as the chief rabbi to all the rabbis in London. And it was, 40, 50 rabbis that were there. It was a small dinner. And one of the things that he was asked, which he was asked time and again, is, could he tell us a bit about the path to success, and about if he'd ever experienced or he knew or tasted failure. And it was that question that was ignited him. I remember he became very enamored, and he said, failure? Do you know how many failures I have had? Far more failures than success. And the point is that when people achieve and go on to great things, very often there's a gloss that is placed over that person's failures or setbacks. And I think we all do a great disservice. I am inspired more by the fact when I hear that people have had setbacks, that they've fallen, that they've faltered. And at the same time, when I hear that they continue to climb and grow, I'm inspired by them, because it is a fallacy. Do not believe it, that anyone that's achieved anything in life has achieved it purely on a road to unfettered success. It does not exist. Every Jew has had setbacks. It doesn't matter how great, it doesn't matter what they've accomplished. Don't look at it as they're out there. How can I possibly aspire or be inspired to emulate them? It's absolute rubbish. Everyone has their own challenges, and we have to recognize that there is this device inside us, which, whether we like it or not, it's not a pleasant part of life, but this device that makes us fluctuate. We go up and we go down like yo-yos in emotions and in the road to success. 1 minute we're managing to accomplish, to progress and to grow, and the next minute the negative side of us has pushed us down. But when we fall, and I was discussing it with somebody this week who was struggling, I said to them, when you fall, you have to recognize you've done something that's wrong, and straight away you have to pick yourself off the floor, dust yourself off, and say, right, now that I've recognized that failure, that is the next rung which I'm going to push down on. I'm going to push down. In other words, I'm going to fall, but it's a fall that is going to enable and fuel me to rise. So please, God, friends, we should all be inspired to rise to great heights. The message from tonight is to recognize the fluctuations, the inconsistencies are part and parcel of who the Jewish people are. And the danger, the neon red lights that we have to watch out for, is that when we have those stumbles and falls, the voice that we hear in our head is, this is who you truly are. You see, you can't be anything else. Stop being a pretender. Stop trying to be something that you're not. Don't allow those moments of falling to define who you are. It's human nature. Pick yourself up, aim for the stars, and then you'll, please God, reach the stars. Wishing everyone well. Please God, we should have a safe Shabbat, a good Shabbat, a wonderful Shabbat. Looking forward to being back into shul and looking forward to sending you all the Hacken blog tomorrow. Have a great night and a great Shabbat.